Okay, good morning, everyone. We're back, says Baruch Hashem. Okay, so where did we leave off? We left off, we're in the middle of discussing the text of the MAH NISHTANA, right? The Mishnah told us that after doing a number of things to provoke curiosity from the children, after setting up our Seder plate, all the details around that, after making Kiddush, after dipping already once, which was part of the things to get curiosity, after breaking the middle matzah, so that when we recite the Haggadah, we have the matzah in front of, we have the broken matzah in front of us. The poor man's bread, right? This juncture, we pour the second cup, which is another form of evoking curiosity. And then Kana ben Shara, now the child asks the questions. Which the Mishnah said, at least according to one interpretation, he should have picked up on something till now. If he still hasn't, inform him of the following four things that are unique about tonight from other nights. That was our Mishnah. What did our Mishnah say? Matzah, marar, dipping twice, and roasted meat. The Jerusalem Talmud had only 3 questions, which were
dipping, not more.
Which was dipping,
First.
matzah, and roasted, not marar and not leaning. So leaning is neither in Babylonian nor the Jerusalem.
It's also missing.
Marar is missing from the Jerusalem Talmud, so it's kind of.
And they put dipping first.
And they put dipping first.
Which is
so
not
we learned
by any of the old Siddurim, apparently.
No. So all the old Siddurim do have dipping first.
They do have dipping.
Which the Rebbe explained, because dipping matzah marar goes in the order of events, because we dip first, then we eat matzah, then we eat marar. Leaning is only the 4th question, because leaning was added later in time. The question is when and how. What's the problem with when and how? The Gra, the Gilad Vilna Gaon, suggested that leaning was added when they lost the question of roasted. The question of roasting meat is only when the temple stands. Temple's no longer here, so we lost the question. Add a question of why we lean. Then we rejected that answer because we have in Rambam all 5 questions. We have in Rambam dipping, matzah, marar, leaning, and roasted.
This is
which means
5 law of neshama.
Yeah, which means that there's a time period when the temple stands and you have the question of roasting, and you also have the question of leaning. Right? So the Rebbe says there must be a text that the Rambam had that's no longer extant, in which somewhere in the Mishnah, he said the Gemara, is mentioned this question of leaning. Otherwise, the Rambam would have not made it up on his own, that he has leaning and roasting at the same time. Now, that's what we said so far. This rings a bell for everybody?
Yeah.
Okay. Now everybody's going to address all of this. Another angle of how to understand all of this, considering there's a lot of confusion as to what exactly the 4 questions ought to be, or maybe 5. We have 5 different questions with multiple different sources. The first question, 5 questions are: why matzah? Why marar? Why dip twice? Why lean? Why only roasted meat? So roasted meat clearly only is there when the temple stands. We have one source that has all 5, Rambam. We have another source that only has 3, dipping, matzah, and roasting. We have a Mishnah, our Mishnah, which has 4, matzah, marar, dipping, and roasted. And then we have our text, which has dipping, matzah, marar, leaning.
May I interject a comment?
Yeah.
I would think that Rambam may have included the 5th one is because at some point we all believe that the temple will be reestablished. So therefore, we don't want to lose, right? We don't want to lose.
Yes, that's very good.
The knowledge of that.
100%. So that's 100% correct. But what Rambam does many times is, in the times of the temple, this is the halacha. Now the temple's not standing, this is the halacha.
He didn't do that.
He didn't do that. He just put down 5 questions.
Okay.
right? Let's see for a second. Second, we'll look it up very quickly since you asked. Chapter 8 of Laws of Chometz and Matzah. Okay. Yeah. Here, questions asked. Dipping. He puts dipping first, by the way.
Well,
Like
the
our-
Jerusalem-
like our-
Like the Jerusalem.
Like our, yeah, Jerusalem, like our version. Then matzah, like our version. Then roasting. Then maror. Then leaning.
Mhm.
And then he says, nowadays, we don't say the roasting question.
That may be akin to.
But it doesn't say in the times of the temple, you don't say leaning. Which means in temple times, you would have said leaning also.
Right, but
That's
that
the point.
comment may be the comment that's similar to saying that this is what we do now as opposed to what we.
Right, but the implication is that when the temple stood, it did all five. Right, which means the leaning question, in Rambam's view, existed in temple times already. It means temple times had five, and now we have four.
Okay.
Whereas the Mishnaic text seems to be there's only four, three or four, either the Jerusalem Talmud or the Babylonian Talmud in temple times. So the Rebbe was saying there must be some text that the Rambam has that has also the leaning question in temple times. Right? As opposed to the way the Gra put it, which was the leaning only came once the roasting was dropped. That's not how Rambam seems to be saying it. Yeah? Okay. So to make sense of all this, the Rebbe says there's so many different variants and different versions and how many questions and what the order is. So what's going on? How do you make sense of all of this? So this is where we are now in the left column of page Lamed Test. So it's the second page in your packet. Left column, the paragraph begins with the word va'oid. The third paragraph on the left. Va'oid yesh laim, I see it. Va'oid yesh laim b'chol.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Flip it over. Flip it over. Oh, it's there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have it? Okay, perfect. We can also suggest, says the Rebbe, but to address all the above, which seems so all over the place. But let's first preface. There are various different variants in all the different manuscripts that are available to us of the Gemara.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We have our printed Gemara, which only began in the 17th century. I'm sorry, in the 19th century, right, in the 1800s. In Vilna. That's what we call it, the Vilna Shas. That's when the printing started, the earlier prints of the Talmud. But this is the print that we have today.
That's when the printing of the Siddur.
No, the printing press already began in much earlier, I think in the 1600s. So there are prints earlier, but the Talmud that we have today is from that print.
Okay.
Right? But there are manuscripts from earlier. People had manuscripts. The Talmud going back 2,500 years.
Right.
Okay, so they exist around. The people who are involved in this world know where these texts are. You can find them online. Today, a lot of them are available.
This would be the Soncino.
Soncino was the first print,
This print.
but I'm referring to the Vilna print, which is a couple hundred years later. That's the standard we have, the Vilna print,
Oh,
by the Ram family.
later.
Much later. It's a standardized one we have. That universally everybody uses is the standard Vilna
It's
Shas.
called Vilna Shas.
It's the Vilna Shas. It's the Vilna Talmud because that's the standardized printing that we have with the Rashi.
1800s.
Somewhere in the 1800s, yeah. With Rashi and Taisus on the margins and the page numbers, that all begins only 150 something years ago, 200 years ago, not so long ago. Earlier than that, it was just either manuscripts or you had some print. In Prague, they printed one, and Cincino earlier they printed, and some other places they printed different Talmuds. Different people who are known for printing them. At any rate, that was referring to here to manuscripts. Now, these manuscripts are available. You can find them today online. A lot of them you can find in the National Israeli Library online. If you check out the National Israel Library online, you can find a lot of these Jewish manuscripts, scans of them. Okay, so there are various different texts and variants to the text in these different manuscripts, loidak b'haseder, not just in the order of the questions, right? Like we saw already, the Jerusalem Talmud versus the Babylonian Talmud, different orders and how they put the 4 questions together. Ki'im gam b'minyan hakushos. There are differences not just in the order of the questions, but also in the number of questions, the amount of questions, which we already saw also.
Yeah.
Yeshmo shahushmata kushmas marar. Some texts exclude the question of marar. For example, the Jerusalem Talmud. Oitzoli. There are even texts, says the Rebbe, that don't have the question of roasting meat. Even when the temple stood, because these are the Mishnaic texts, right? So the Rebbe is saying that if you look at the manuscripts, you'll find a whole bunch of variations in the text of the MAH Nishtana. Not just in the order of the questions, but even the amount of questions and which questions are in, which questions are out. So this adds further to the confusion. Like if we had all the manuscripts in front of us and we saw all these different variants, you'd be like, wait, what? Which one should we say? What should we do? Right? Following the problem here? Yeah. It's a basic problem, no? Right? It's hard to make sense of it. Says the Rebbe.
I mean, we were trying to figure out about the leaning part.
So
arguments, well, it wasn't in the Gemara.
It came later.
I mean, it wasn't in the Mishnah, but neither was the roasting either.
According to one text.
Right. So
it's hard
to use that as an argument.
Which is why the Rebbe said earlier that the Rambam must have had a text that did include leaning. In other words, if you're of the view that leaning came after the Talmud, no problem. But then you cannot have leaning in the same sentence as roasting, because roasting is definitely only in Talmud. So if Rambam puts leaning and roasting in the same text, it must be because he had a text that did that. But even if we ignore the Rambam's text that allegedly existed, which actually the Rebbe says must have existed,
Right.
But even put that aside, we're still left with tons of confusion. Because even with the remaining questions, the remaining 3, let's say, if you got rid of roasted, matzah mara and dipping, the orders are different. Some of them don't have roasting at all, and some of them have marar. Yes, exactly right. So explains the Rebbe. It's such a simple way of understanding it, and it's going to be based on something we learned earlier about the nature of MAH Nishtana. Says the Rebbe, Hatam yesh leimar. The reason might be ki al pi din, as far as the letter of the law goes, ein ma'akev leimar b'dafka kol hakushos. You don't need to say all the questions. Not even in the first instance. It's not even like best case scenario, you say all the questions. No. We already learned the expression from the story of Abaye, who asked about why we're moving the table away. And Rabbi said, Petratem Leimar, you've exempted us from saying MAH Nishtana. So they was taking that position.
That's a minority.
Not necessarily a minority.
No.
Not necessarily a minority. But Rashbam's position, which says you don't need to ask any of the questions. As long as you're getting... Well, I'll get to Tosfos in a second and why I think that Rebbe is not necessarily only taking Rashbam. Let's go to Rashbam's route now.
Okay.
Rashbam, which says you don't need to ask the 4 questions at all, so long as you're asking anything. Even if you're asking about how
the curiosity has been piqued.
As long as the kid is engaged, he asked a question. He asked why you're moving the table. Why are you moving the table away? He asked why you're filling up the second cup before you've eaten your meal yet. He's asking why you broke the middle matzah.
But we learned earlier that
good enough.
Irrespective of that, the leader has to still recite the 4 questions.
Rambam's view, which is a chiddush, a novelty. Where does Rambam get that? That's a good question. But as far as the letter of the law goes, any question from the kid is good enough. Which means you don't have to ask the 4 questions at all.
That's what the Rebbe is commenting here?
Yes. Now, I'm going to go even further and say, if you look at the precise wording of the Rebbe doesn't say you don't need to say any of the 4 questions. He says you don't have to say all of them, meaning, perhaps the Rebbe is saying is, even if you follow Tosfos' view, which says that when they moved the table away and Abaye said, hey, what are you doing? That wasn't the end of the questions, but that was the beginning that led him to the rest of the 4 questions.
It's the preamble too.
Preamble 2. But who said you have to say all these 4 in these order? Maybe just one.
All of these and order 2 separate.
Correct. And says Rebbe, even if you're following Tosfos, Who said you have to have this to order dafka and you have to say
And
all
this
four?
number,
So in Ashbam, certainly you don't have to have any of the four questions. As long as you get some question at all, some curiosity is good enough. But even if you're going to follow Taisus, which says that when Abaye moved the table, asked about moving the table away, it was a preamble to get to the MAH NISHTANA. Okay, but who said it has to be the entirety of the MAH
so
NISHTANA?
it's sort of a middle ground between the two.
Oh, who said it has to be the whole MAH NISHTANA? Right? So therefore, says the Rebbe, therefore, right from the start, when our sages implemented the four questions, or the MAH NISHTANA, let's call it, because you don't even know if there's four, maybe there's three, maybe there's five. But once the sages implemented the MAH NISHTANA, right away there were different customs. Because everybody just did it the way they wanted to. Because what was the instruction of the sages when they said to say MAH NISHTANA? Says the Rebbe, they were suggesting the instruction was, here are some questions for your kids to ask. What order? I don't know, you decide. How many of them? I don't know, whatever, you decide.
Suggested.
Yeah. So in other words, not always, in other words, we have very rigid custom as they are to be precise, but not always like that in the original. The original could have been an outline of what the custom is and then of what the instruction is, and you decide how you want to do it. So the outline is ask the MAH NISHTANA. Which questions? You decide. How many? You decide. What order? You decide.
The only thing that doesn't,
Follow?
I follow, but the only thing that seems to throw a thorn in that of thinking, at least for me, is that the Rambam.
We'll get that in a second. We'll get that in a second.
All right.
Very good question. We'll get that in a second.
You
The
know
next
what?
paragraph,
You
yes.
understand what-
Next question, next paragraph that we're going to address.
Okay.
Okay, very good, very good. So good thinking. Okay. So if you said, Rebbe, right from the start, there were different customs that emerged. Because the instruction was never to follow exactly this order. The instruction was, here are the four questions you should be teaching your kids. Or here are the five questions you should be teaching your kids. What order, which ones, whatever. Here are the questions your kids should be asking. Maybe there wasn't at all a set custom. 1 year guys are this way, 1 year that way. What's the difference? As long as you follow the outline of what you were told to do. But over time, while the temple was still standing, as is clear from Rambam, at some point during the temple while the temple stood, the customs have become uniform. And they instituted that everybody should follow a uniform custom of asking all five questions, and in a particular order. But this is only over time. Right? So from the start, there's an instruction. Here are the questions. Make your kids ask them, whatever you want. And over time, the communities become more uniformed. And over time, they said, okay, here's the best way to do it. Do it like this order, all five questions.
And this was all during temple times?
Yes, in Rambam's view.
When this rabbinic
yes, it's over hundreds of years.
Yeah.
It's a couple hundred years.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So it evolves over time. And at some point,
all during
pre
and during
as is clear from Rambam.
Yeah.
As I was saying to Rambam is your point.
Yeah.
Sometime during temple times, it's all become uniform because Rambam says all five questions.
Right.
Yeah. And for what purpose? Quote, Sheyu kol Yisrael oisim ma'aseh. That was quoting from, I'll explain in a second where it comes from. Because the sages wanted that all Jews should do one thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Not divided.
Similar to the explanation given with respect to Avo's instruction with respect to the sounding of the shofar. And then besides to the Beis Yosef. Beis Yosef explains like this. I'll explain what that was referring to, and then we'll understand how it works in MAH NISHTANA. We have, when we sound the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, this is the mitzvah. Tkiya, teruah, and tekiya. That's the mitzvah. The question is, what is teruah? Tekiya, we know what it is. Straight blast. That's tekiya. What's a teruah?
It's a wave.
So we're not sure, actually.
The blast in the waves.
So either it's or it's two. The Gemara explains it's two types of crying, either panting or wailing. Those are two types of teruah. We call them teruah and shvarim, but they're really both teruah. Teruah is a broken up sound. Tekiya is a straight sound. Teruah is a broken up sound. But what kind of broken up sound? Like a wailing or like a panting? So explains Beis Yosef that initially You can do whichever one you want, because as long as you're doing some sort of broken up sound in the middle, do whatever you want. Which means some communities were only doing Tkiya, Shvarim, Tkiya. Other communities were doing Tkiya, Teruah, Tkiya. And other communities were doing Tkiya, Shvarim, Teruah, Tkiya. And that was all fine, because you were still satisfying the original instruction, which was Tkiya, Teruah, Tkiya. Because what's a Teruah? Teruah is any broken up sound, either panting or wailing. Choose which one you want.
It's similar to what we're talking about.
And what's happening now?
You
Explain the way said.
It was do what you want, but then it can unify it.
That's right. So long as you're satisfied. So originally was satisfy this requirement. How do you want to do it? Whatever. Over time, Rebbe decided, okay, you know what? It's not fair. It's not appropriate that some Jews do it this way, some that way. We're going to make a uniform. We're going to do all three.
Ezra did a lot of it.
That's for other things. Yes. For example, Ezra did it for davening. Ezra did it for davening. Hashem said, daven to me. How do you daven to me? I don't know. You decide. Ezra came along and said, okay, here's a text which satisfies the biblical requirements. So similar thing here. As a Rebbe, as the Beis Yosef explains it with respect to Abahu, who came along and organized that we should have the Tkiya Shofar the way we have it. Tkiya Shvarim, Tkiya, and then all three types of Teruah. The combined Teruah, the singular Shvarim, and the singular Teruah.
Cover everything. Cover all opinions.
Cover all of it. Cover all variations, but all Jews should cover all variations.
That's right.
So a similar thing here, says the Rebbe, this is what must have happened with the 4 questions. To begin with, the instruction was, here are the types of questions you should be getting your kid to notice. Do it as you like. So the different texts and different manuscripts that have only 3 questions, only 4 questions, different orders, says that that's fine. That's all pre-uniformity. And pre-uniformity, anybody did it the way they wanted to. At some point, the customs have become merged, uniform. Everybody should do all 5 questions. And this explains
Rambam.
This explains Rambam, and it explains the various texts and why they seem different. This same rationale, this is now Levi New speaking, suggesting based on Rabbi Menachem Kasher's monumental book called Haggadah Shlema, part of a series called Torah Shlema. He writes a similar thing with respect to the Haggadah in a whole. We also have various texts in the Haggadah, right? Because how does it work? We're learning the Mishnah now, right? The Mishnah doesn't give us the text of the Haggadah. What does it say to do? Oh, say that paragraph of Adam Ayinu because it begins in shame and ends in praise. Say that paragraph Mitzchila because it begins in shame and ends in praise. It doesn't give us an exact text. It gives us an outline. So what do you do with an outline?
You improvise.
You improvise. So right from the start, there were varying texts. People had different customs of how to do the Haggadah, especially since the Mishnah says, or the Haggadah actually says, anyone who elaborates in the story, good for you. The more the merrier. Okay, so you elaborate as you see fit, you elaborate as you see fit, and you elaborate as you see fit, so long as you're following this sage's instruction in the Mishnah. And thus, varying texts like Haggadah in different communities. But over time, they become much more and more uniform. Certain variants still remain, but they become more uniform as the customs emerge and communities interact with each other and communities share with each other what the customs are, families share, and over time it becomes more and more uniform. And by the time you get to a printing press, everything becomes uniform because it's just print, exactly the same all over, with slight variations here and there. This is also similar to the why different sitters have different texts, right? And why there are certain things uniform, like the Shemona Esrei is uniform everywhere. That's Ezra. But then you have other parts of the Siddur that are different. Slight variation here, slight variation there. How you do before Baruch Shamar, how you do after Baruch Shamar. Slight variations like that. Right? Because they all are customs that emerged over time to satisfy the original instructions. Similar to what we're learning here about the Haggadah, all these various different texts. They have different manishtanas, different questions, different order, because they were all there to satisfy the original instruction. Over time, they become more uniform, similar to the Beis Yosef's comment with respect to how the blowing of the shofar became uniform, even though originally people were doing it different ways, all satisfying the original instruction. Okay, hope this gives more clarity. All right, this is a very fundamental idea of understanding how Torah liturgy evolved, and you understand where custom comes, where instruction comes, where halacha comes, biblical, rabbinic, and then custom, and how these things evolve over time. Okay, wonderful day, Yidden. Tomorrow we'll finish Rebbe's comment on Haggadah and go back to the next Mishnah, which discusses the Pesach Matzah Maror at the end of the Haggadah. And then the drinking a second cup of wine.
It's very interesting.
The beginning of the Hallel. Sorry, yep.
It's very interesting how it all comes together.
That's right. So it all now you have this. If this becomes clear, so much of what seems confusing about like customs and texts and things become much more clear when you understand this evolution. Okay, wonderful day, Yidden.
Yeah.